Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Donna Latson Gittens, your host this evening. Callie Crossley has the night off. Tonight, Black and Brown Philanthropy. BIPOC donors are taking bold steps to change the face of philanthropy, funding causes to empower communities of color and build racial equity. It's a shift that's been happening over the years due to the health disparities highlighted during the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. Historically, communities of colors are givers, donating to churches through giving circles and local groups. Black and brown philanthropists are intentional about putting their dollars toward improving communities, addressing systemic racism, and social justice initiatives. How is their influence impacting the state of philanthropy, often associated with white, wealthy donors? Plus, what are the ways to attract young donors of color? Joining me to discuss this topic, Bithiah Carter, President and CEO of the New England Blacks in Philanthropy, Danielle Kin, Director of the Asian Community Fund at the Boston Foundation, Aixa Beauchamp, co-founder of the Latino Equity Fund at the Boston Foundation, and Natanja Oquendo, Executive Director of the Boston Women's Fund. It's so great to see you all tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Donna.
You're welcome. So I'm going to start with you, Natanja. We've known each other for a very long time, and I've known you from your work at the Boston Foundation, and now you're at the Women's Fund. Talk a little bit about your work when you were at the Boston Foundation and helped to contribute to the grassroots strategy.
Yeah. So I often say I grew up at the Boston Foundation. I have always been in the nonprofit sector, but being behind the doors of a philanthropic institute that was as prestigious as the Boston Foundation was something that was so exciting to me. It's important to know that I started off as an executive assistant. So I was supporting the vice president for program at the time. And I think we had a lot of the same views when it came to philanthropy. And one of those views that was incredibly personal to me, Donna, was very early on, I realized that decisions were being made, but not with the people who were actually going to be impacted by those decisions. Incredibly brilliant people, right? There was many reports we were reading. But what we weren't doing was actually going to ask individuals and communities what they needed. And so that seemed to be like a very, that seemed to me to be an opportunity. I got promoted a few times and was asked to build a strategy that really focused on grassroots leaders. So leaders who are in their communities doing incredible work, often flying under the radar. And I had the opportunity to kind of be out there, like building relationships with these leaders, helping them understand how philanthropy worked and funding them.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And Danielle, you are the director of the Asian Fund. Talk a little bit about how you got into philanthropy.
Absolutely. So I certainly never expected to go on a career in philanthropy. I think oftentimes I think about how within the Asian community there is this strong sense of giving to your neighbors, giving to your church friends, whoever really needs support. And I often joke that, you know, we were doing giving circles before we knew that that was a term that was used in philanthropy. And so I've worked in a lot of state advocacy roles in government, but I've also worked at a number of nonprofits in the Boston area. And one thing I think that's really important that drives my work now at the Asian Community Fund is thinking about the ways in which all the nonprofits I worked were really scrappy and had to hustle for every single dollar that we brought through the door. And so in my work at the Asian Community Fund, I really think about the ways in which resources and partnerships can unlock opportunity, but really accelerate the work that an organization is doing. And I think the work of philanthropy is really making sure that we think about legacy and sustainability so that every organization is not hunting for the one new grant that's coming in the door, but that we really invest deeply in the core work that organizations and community groups do every single day.
Yeah, I want to get back to that whole issue of, you know, the amounts of the grants.
Certainly.
And, you know, and the types of grants that you give and that kind of thing. But before I do that, I want to ask you, Bithiah, you were in finance. And how did you come into philanthropy?
I kind of fell through the sky in some ways. I think I had a journey that I think we're going to see more of in the future. I worked in finance for many years. I worked at John Hancock, and it was great. You were invited to maybe a dinner here or there, and particularly when you're of color, you're not really seen as a philanthropist. You're seen as maybe an add-on. You're seen as maybe someone that, if you're of a certain net worth, maybe you'll write a check, but I don't know, maybe it won't be too much. So I was invited to a dinner or two, but I never was considered part of the philanthropic community. And when I wanted to actually move, I took a little hiatus, and because my husband actually at that time got another job, and he said, well, kind of look around and figure out what you want to do. And I actually started working at a nonprofit, volunteering, because I grew up thinking that you give your time, you give your talent, you go and you help the community. And from there, I have to really say it was Marilyn Anderson Chase that was at United Way that said, hey, what are you doing over there? We want you to come over here. And so I came with the mindset that, oh, I'm in philanthropy. This is great. Everyone, we're going to all work together. And I realized that philanthropy was its own animal, its own entity, its own way of looking at things from that sort of liberal point of view, but don't become too uppity point of view. And so working there, one of the things, and it's, much like Natanja said, whenever you're working in philanthropy, you tend to solve your own issue. What is the issue burning in you? And one of the things that was burning in me was the fact that we weren't recognizing all the assets that were around us. I was an asset at John Hancock, and no one asked me to do anything. No one asked me to get involved. And also, I realized in the philanthropic community, we weren't talking to each other. So.
And Aixa, what do you say? You came out of education, you graduated from Harvard, and then you started right at a big foundation.
Yeah, I did. One of the things that I realized, like Bithiah, I wasn't thinking about philanthropy because, like Natanja said and Danielle said, we were doing philanthropy in our communities before we knew what it was. But one of the reasons why I got involved, it was very much because I wanted to give back to my community. My parents came from very humble beginnings, but one of the things that my father always did every year for the kids in my neighborhood, and he was an entrepreneur, and I didn't know if he was having a good year or a bad year, is that he would buy school supplies for the kids on my street, on my block. And that really gave me a sense of kind of the work that we were doing. So when it came to working in philanthropy, I took what Natanja was saying, that community grassroots perspective about how we do philanthropy, and got involved there. One of the things that, like Bithiah said, that's very important is that you have this growing number of Black and brown philanthropists who are just not being recognized for their philanthropy. It's seen through a white lens, and now with the whole billionaire model, like Mackenzie Scott, it's seen through that lens. But not enough attention is being focused on these Black and brown leaders and Asian leaders who are funding a lot of racial and social justice work. And that's a story that's not being told when it comes to the donors of color.
That's a critical question or point you made, and that gets to the crisis funding that happens. So we had all these, the health disparities, we had pandemic, you had the police deaths, the police motivated deaths. How do you take that crisis funding? Everybody wants to throw money at when something happens, but when it dies down, nobody wants to pick up the reins. So how do you address that?
So you should know that I'm going to speak specifically about the Latino community. There is still persistent underfunding in our community. For instance, the 2% data that's thrown around, that Latino organizations and causes only receive 2% of funding that's about $480 billion a year. And so although money was throwing around during COVID, and there's more of sensitivity around what has gone on with George Floyd and racial reckoning, those numbers are not shifting in great minutes. So you're having this patchwork done. And so this is why kind of more attention to donors of color should be made around here, because those are the ones who are really doing the work.
So Danielle, I was going to ask Danielle, as it relates to, because you started a COVID relief fund, and how did you get that off the ground and reaching into the Asian community? speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So we saw a convergence of attention finally on the needs of the Asian community in light of the rising rates of anti-Asian hate and violence that we had seen across the country. And I think, as Aixa was saying, there were blips in philanthropy and giving. There was more attention, there were more news stories paid to the plight of the Asian community, and yet I wonder now, 3 years coming out of the pandemic, how much of that has actually sustained.
Right.
In fact, I imagine that we've reverted back to the typical way of doing business. And I've seen that certainly happen in the field of philanthropy, in that we go back to the usual suspects, the organizations and the leaders in town that folks know, and we're not dismantling and disrupting really in a sustainable way how we approach giving, how we approach what partnerships look like. And so within the Asian Fund, we've seen a lot of energy and excitement around the work that we're doing to finally draw more attention to the needs of the Asian community, but far more needs to happen. I think we've seen some progress, but certainly there needs to be a lot more work to be paid to really understand and unpack the real diverse needs that still exist here within the Asian community.
I was going to speak to you. Go ahead, Natanja.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I said to Danielle earlier, I'm in a situationship with philanthropy. I feel like some days I'm like, look at us doing such great work. And then there's other days where the white supremacy is so prevalent. And one of the things that Danielle just said that kind of sparked something in me was about I came into the Boston Women's Fund in 2020, so it was during the midst of COVID and the racial reckoning. And so a lot of attention, whether you are, right, when new leaders come into an organization, there's a lot of attention that's given to them. And so I noticed that, but I also noticed now, two and a half years in, that I was trending. We are a trendy sector. We're not a sector that wants to stay with something for the long haul. We want really quick results. We want people to solve problems that have been embedded in our nation for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we often put that on the backs of Black and brown leaders. So that just really resonated with me.
No, I think that's a great point, but there's another part to it too that I know, Bithiah, you can speak to, and that is, who's in the boardroom, who are on the boards of these foundations, who can help to make change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it needs to change.
Yes.
And that's the short answer. We're not seeing the change that we're expecting because these issues are systemic, and they're systemic because the people behind the scenes are the same people that make the decisions. And it does not help when you have a only one on a board. It has to change completely. And so the question in philanthropy, and the people sitting around that table is similar to the Martin Luther King quote. Philanthropy is commendable, but you can't overlook the circumstances that causes philanthropy. So the people are in those boardrooms are sitting there thinking, okay, I'm doing this great job, but to the many points that we've raised here, what about to your point, not only the systemic issue, but how do we think differently?
Yes.
We came out of COVID, this place that showed us many of us are suffering, all of us are suffering, but if you're not recognizing the assets in our community, and you're not recognizing the pipeline that should be on those boards, but rather the pipeline that you have because this is what you're familiar with, very little will change. And I think we have to really flip philanthropy on its head to really ask the question, why are we here?
Yes.
And not ask just the grantees, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, but philanthropy itself has to ask, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve?
And we also have to be mindful that data, data talks louder than actions. And one of the things, the Center for Effective Philanthropy did a report recently, which shows that the shift in terms of diversifying these philanthropic and corporate foundations and board is still
hasn't changed.
It still hasn't changed
right.
yet. There's a bit more, and there's an only, right? But it hasn't changed to the fact that we're really making shifts in how those institutions really think about communities of color and giving for community colors. And it goes back to what I was saying, Donna. It is really interesting that on the philanthropic side, right, that we're looking to have, that there are these not alignments between community and philanthropy. And then on the donor side, philanthropy is not even recognizing these donors of color as assets to the work that they do.
And I want to, there's a critical point in all of this, that, the recognition of donors don't have to have $100,000, $1 million, $2 million. You have donors who are on the ground, people who are families that have done it cultures that have done it, you know, with the small social circles, or, you know, cooperatives, that kind of thing. How important, specifically in the Asian community, are you seeing that there are donors who are willing to step up? That, you know, this idea of the model, the myth of the model Asian, really, how does that affect this philanthropy?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I've seen in my role at the Asian Community Fund is we've approached institutions and funders and donors, and, you know, we tell them about the work that we're doing at the Asian Community Fund, we tell them about the needs of the Asian community, and they've come back to us and say, you know, is there actually a need there? You know, I look at my neighbors, they're all doing pretty well, you know, and I think it's exactly the model minority myth that perpetuates this idea that Asians are affluent, well off, you know, kind of put the head down, do the work, and really don't talk about the needs in our community. But I think it's really important to understand that the Asian community is incredibly diverse. I mean, we come from 50 countries, we speak 200 languages, we're the fastest growing undocumented community in this country. A third of our community speak a language other than English as their first language. So when we think about equity and philanthropy and grant making, we really need to make sure that we also name the Asian community as part of a group that we're working to support as well.
Yeah, and Natanja, I wanted to speak to you specifically about the organizations that you fund, you know, small businesses and nonprofits, and maybe in some cases small businesses who are, you know, women-owned, women-run.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the pressure that they feel and need and the funding they need?
My whole life's passion now is about my grantees, and I just want to say that 50% of my grantees actually give to the fund, and I think that's incredibly important. I think part of it is that we don't recognize, Aixa just said this, we don't recognize everybody as a philanthropist. And at the start of the Boston Women's Fund, 40 years ago, I think I'm the oldest, but I just want to make the point that each one of these organizations was built started because mainstream philanthropy was not doing the work that we were asking them to do, including ours. Our grassroots organizations are struggling with the same things, quite frankly, Donna, that I'm struggling with. They are seeking funding. 1.9% national funding goes to women-led organizations. If you are a woman of color, it is 0.08%. There is a lot of work for us to do. We also know that women give, when women are invested in, their dollar goes around the community 3 times more. When you are wealthy, you're most likely to give 1% of your money away. When you are poor, you're most likely to give 4% of your money away. I think we have always had the belief at the Boston Women's Fund that anyone can be a philanthropist. So we have $5 donors and we have $500,000 donors. And I think what we feel so lucky about is that people see themselves as a giver and as a change maker in the work that we're doing,
So
no matter what.
So how do you get people to see themselves as the giver? I know you live to tell people with your conversations that you do at NEBIP. How do you get people to understand that, you know, regardless of the amount that you're giving, get involved, participate?
I think people are involved. We just have to recognize it.
Yes.
And I think that what I constantly think about, and particularly with the reports that we do, the Giving Black reports, since when we were brought to these shores, we started giving back in the 1600s. And we need to talk about those stories. You know, it's funny that we're sitting here in Black History Month and everyone's going to tell a story about one inventor or this inventor. We're going to see a lot of Martin Luther King. Well, we should see a lot of our donors. We should see those stories in front of us. We put out a post about the blacks being erased, and we got a post back saying, we're not erased, you know, we're telling the story. We have 750,000 stories. We're 45 million people. We have more than 45 million stories. And to acknowledge that, and not as a craft, but in the same light as a Gates, or in the same light as Soros, we have to tell those stories. We have to better understand what has happened in our community, and then not only be proud of it, but be able to tell those stories as our stories and not just the history of someone else.
Right. And I think also we have to really change the narrative and stop seeing philanthropy as basically a white
handout.
narrative,
And
right?
a
white
handout.
narrative.
That's
and
right.
start seeing this perception that people of color are challenged with so many issues in their communities that they're probably are not giving to philanthropy. I think that narrative. So I want to reference a report that was done last year called Donors of Color. And in that report, there's a lot of statistics that show that there is about 1.3 million households led by a person of color who have liquid assets of more than $1 million. And when you dissect that, you have an array of big gift donors. You have donors who gave to the African American Museum, who a number of them gave from $1 to $20 million. And in the Latino Museum at the Smithsonian, you have Latino donors who gave from $1 to $10 million. So again, what Bithiah said, those stories are not being told.
No.
I had to go into a report that talks about donors of color to get that kind of statistics. So I think that narrative. And going back to Danielle's point, and actually Natanja's point, the Latino Equity Fund, that used to be called the Latino Legacy Fund, was created because mainstream philanthropy was not responding to the needs in our community. And it was created by and for Latinos.
Right.
And it's 12
So
Latino philanthropists who raised the first $1 million for the fund. Think about that. 12 Latino philanthropists raised the first $1 million for the fund with the help of the Boston Foundation. So that's a powerful story that's not being told.
No, and I think on the flip side, and this is really important, we have young people coming up.
Yes.
What is the message that we're saying to them about how important it is to give back? And I get time and talent, but financially, how do we get them engaged? How do we excite them? You know, what's the strategy?
I think they are invited. They're there. And I want to go back to Aixa's point, but who's highlighting them? We have young donors. I mean, for example, even with us, we had a Lemonade Day. Young kids want to give. Not only do they want to give, they want to read those proposals. They are a part of their community, they are civically engaged. Unfortunately, the media shows a different story. So he that controls the image controls the mind. So we have to control our image. We have to start telling those stories. It can't be buried in a report. It has to be part of our everyday language. It has to shift the way that the foundation shows us on their website. It can't just be a white person giving to us or we're doing hopscotch. We have to see, or we have to make sure and hold others accountable for the images that they're putting out there, the information that's put out there, and that it's not in the back room, but it is on every show, every newspaper, every mainstream, because we are the mainstream now.
Not only that, but I'm sorry. Not only that, but the shift also, we have to think that there is a generational shift going on here, right? When you think about these young donors, a lot of them are giving in crowdfunding, giving on, all those other things that philanthropy still hasn't caught up to that whole area of how these young people are giving. And that's going to be interesting once they do, because what Bithiah says, there you'll find that they are giving in larger numbers. We haven't just captured the data.
I was going to say, when I was 15, 16, I didn't know what philanthropy was.
Right.
I did know what generosity was. I knew when my mother didn't have enough food in her fridge and Maria came over with food, that was philanthropy. I understood when someone donated clothes to my family that was philanthropy. At the Boston Women's Fund, we often think about young people being integrated at every level. So not just, we have programs that are called Youth in Transformative Philanthropy, and that where we teach our young people about philanthropy, and they're allowed, or not allowed, but they lead us in giving money to other youth-led organizations. So I think it's also about helping them see themselves, one, in the sector, but two, as already givers.
And power.
And the
Yeah.
power.
And they have the
They have the
power.
power. That's right. And how do you use that well?
That's
Danielle?
In particular, I think that the younger generations really understand these core issues and how systemic they are. So when you see the folks that are leading rallies at the State House and protests and really demanding systemic change via legislation and policy, it's often led by young people. And I think about the ways in which philanthropy can not just support, a direct service initiative here, a program over here, but really invest deeply in the young leaders that are driving systemic policy change. And I think really investing deeply around advocacy and policy is a space that I would say younger donors really understand at a foundational level, but that's a place that they can inspire philanthropy to do better as well.
But can I say philanthropy has to be actually expand the definition. So when we think about philanthropy, we see it as time, talent, treasure, ties, and testimony. That advocacy is important, that the networks are important, that we can have this conversation that says how much is really going to us, when what do we deserve. So we have to expand the definition, and we can do that.
Okay, so we're coming up to the close, but so I have a question. Each of you has 30 seconds. What is the legacy? How do we build that legacy piece so that it can continue and bring in more people, different people from different cultures to begin to, and even the word philanthropy even bothers me. What, you know, how do we excite people about that? So I'll start with you, Aixa.
I think a part of that is just what we've been saying here. We have to change the narrative. We have to show the faces. We have to let people understand that philanthropy is more than just this white narrative of large givers, and to really focus on building that one-to-one in our communities.
Okay.
We have
30 seconds, Bithiah.
We have to highlight people's time, talent, treasure, ties, and testimony, and highlight it in a way that it becomes part of mainstream conversation.
Great. Danielle?
We need to invest right now in leaders of color that are already doing the work. And they might not be doing it in the way that traditional philanthropy might recognize, but we know that they are leaders on the ground right now, and we need to invest deeply in their work, generously in their work, and sustain their work, so that way we can partner with them for the long term.
Natanja, you got 2 seconds.
We need to reimagine philanthropy and rebuild it, is what I would say. I think there's so much work for us to do, and we're building on not solid ground.
Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you. It's great to be with friends. So I appreciate you all and the message that you have for people about community and philanthropy. I hope you enjoyed the conversation too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It went by fast, didn't it?
Yes.